Hello and welcome to Tower Talk, vital conversations from Prospect Park United Methodist Church. I'm Dave Nyberg. Tower Talk looks at the issues of the day from the perspective of members of the Prospect Park UMC community and others from around the Twin Cities region. Joining us in this edition of Tower Talk is Harry Boyte, Senior Scholar in Public Work Philosophy, founder of the International Youth Civic Empowerment Initiative called Public Achievement, and co-founder of the new Institute for Public Life and Work at Augsburg University. Harry is also the author, co-author, and editor of 10 books on democracy, citizenship, community organizing, and democratic movements, and his writings have appeared in more than 100 publications in media outlets around the world. As a young man, Harry worked in the citizenship schools of Martin Luther King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And Harry, always a pleasure to talk with you. Welcome to Tower Talk.
Thank you, Dave. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Well, Harry, let's start off with the current polarization of the political landscape. We have widespread civil unrest and a pandemic that really shows no signs of easing. We're living in a time of tremendous social upheaval, and many would call this an unprecedented time in history. You've seen many changes and societal shifts in your lifetime. How would you describe this moment we're living in compared to earlier moments of turmoil and change?
Well, it's distinctive, and the conflicts are exacerbated by the social media, by the ability to speak anonymously and attack people, by the sophistication of algorithms which know how to inflame people's emotions and push their buttons. All of that is really operating. And then I think also the increasingly polarized or segmented population in terms of partisan beliefs and so forth. But it's important to put it in historical perspective. And of course, there was the Civil War when America went to war. Family members were on opposite sides. But the more recent period was the one I lived through in the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s as a kid and then a teenager and a young man. And that was very inflamed in the South. It was somewhat different in the North. But in the world I grew up in, the rhetoric was more inflammatory, the dangers were more openly violent. The repression and the silencing was much more than today. So I grew up in segregated schools until I went to college. And basically, virtually every one of my peers and my teachers were afraid to say anything about segregation. It wasn't because they didn't care about it, it's that they were afraid. So, and politicians were using very inflammatory rhetoric. And I mean, a kind of pivot in my own life was when I was 12 years old, and my father, who had been the manager of the Atlanta Red Cross and had desegregated the Red Cross and was in favor of school desegregation, which put him as a very rare member, he and my mother, of the community in Atlanta, of European Americans, of whites. But anyway, he started a group that had one plank to keep public schools open when the politicians were saying we're going to close the schools rather than allow desegregation. And his name was in the paper. And I remember coming into our living room early, as I usually have all my life, at 6 a.m. or something, and the phone rang. And the voice on the other side, "We know who you are, we're going to kill you, boy." And we had 150 phone calls in a week.
Wow.
And the only position of help our public education was to keep public schools open. So, I mean, that was a dramatic epic in American history in the South, and a lot of violence and a lot of threatened violence, and people losing their jobs, and sometimes beaten up and killed.
So certainly your life experiences have shown you these many changes that we've gone through, and certainly the time period that we're living in right now, even though there may be changes, there are some repetitions from the past that are happening here today.
Well, there is violence and the threat of violence and huge conflict and a lot of hatred, a lot of demonization, polarization. Yeah, and that was all true for my youth.
Hmm. Harry, you've written an essay for the Kettering Foundation entitled "The Citizen Workers of Democracy." It calls for a bold new perspective on what democracy means and what citizenship actually and really involves. So what is your definition of a citizen worker of democracy?
Well, in the first place, a worker is different than a warrior.
Hmm.
One of the things I've been writing a lot about this year is the war mentality that has taken hold across our society, and certainly around issues of all kinds, and on both right and left, but also kind of in everyday life. Our church men's group the other day was talking about the war mentality, and one of our guys was saying, in Britain, he likes to see cook-offs on television. In Britain, where she watches the cook-offs, he said, people help each other out.
Hmm.
They offer recipes and advice, and in the United States, in the cook-offs, it's cutthroat. You go for the jugular.
Yes, it is.
And another guy from Argentina said, when the rugby players would come to Argentina from the U.S., they did not socialize. They were there for the kill. And then it's a complicated dynamic. I was talking to a colleague, Mike Huggins, who is a city manager, has been the city manager in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, and a great democracy organizer. He's really kind of changed the role of local government from a service provider to a catalyst for citizen involvement and problem solving. But he says, over the last 10 or 15 years, he's really seen the spread of a kind of war mentality in Eau Claire. And it's driven in significant ways by people's seriousness and their sense of urgency about many issues: racism, trafficking, climate, schools. But the language people know to express a sense of urgency is a kind of war language. So us versus them. They are the enemy. Who's the enemy that we can target and demonize? So, and of course, the irony is that it's not an effective way to make change. Right. It's a way to feel righteous, perhaps, or mobilize your troops and develop a certain kind of solidarity. But it's by splitting the citizenry, we lose the capacity to act very effectively, and the creativity and the energy that comes from working together. So in the first place, a citizen worker is not an issue warrior. I would make that contrast. And I think we have developed a culture of issue warriors or warriorism around many questions. But in general, it's also a different understanding of democracy. So it's the horizontal understanding of our democracy. It's among we the people, it's all of us, for all of our disagreements and discomforts and difficulties working together. It's saying that to create healthy communities and a healthy democracy, we have to do that together. So I think there the shift is from thinking of democracy as elections or electing people to do things for us. And that's a big shift.
So that really is, as you describe it, a big part of the change from where we are currently at today in our environment and our understanding, so to speak, for many of us, of what it means to be a member of our democratic society and what the possibilities are, again, by being a citizen worker of democracy.
Yeah, well, so I learned most of the lessons I know about democracy from the movement and from folks like the maids and janitors at Duke, who were my mentors, and they were organizing a union. I remember talking to the janitor of Oliver Harvey, a wonderful man, very real autodidact, very erudite about history, and he'd been involved in the struggle against the poll tax and many things, and he was leading this campaign. In 1964, before I could vote, I was too young to vote.
Hmm.
I was sounding off about the coming election between Barry Goldwater, who was a Republican candidate, and Lyndon Johnson, the Democratic candidate. This was after Kennedy had been assassinated. And I, with all the righteousness of youth, said to Mr. Harvey, there's no difference between Johnson and Goldwater. Johnson is not going to desegregate the South. It's phony, it's absurd to think he's going to desegregate the South. And Mr. Harvey looked at me and with a smile and said, Harry, that's just ridiculous. Of course he's not going to desegregate the South. What do you think the civil rights movement is doing? That's our work. It's not some politician's work. And it's taking place everywhere. And that's what we're doing at Duke, but in the communities. And part of it is voting rights. But he said, don't think about elections as choosing a savior or somebody to fix things for us. Think about elections as determining who helps to create an environment which we can best do our work.
Sure.
And so then he didn't have to go into much detail, but he said, think of the ways, what the stories that the news coverage is, or what role models politicians can play in national leaders, and what we could pass in terms of legislation, and whether federal marshals are going to protect people when they go to the polls, and what kind of agency implementation of policies there are. And all of that makes it is hugely dependent on the environment, the larger political environment. Politicians can help shape the environment. They don't do our work for us. Mm-hmm. So that's a fundamental shift in the way of thinking about elections.
Yeah.
Now, thinking about who can help set the right context or the environment for the work we need to do as citizens.
Kind of plays into one of your observations, taking the we the people approach to the democracy, to our democratic society that makes us all responsible for the entire society. In terms of what specifically that might look like and how that might look different than what we are currently experiencing today, and especially given the complexity of the society that we live in today, for individuals, each one of us, to be responsible for the whole society. What does that look like in your view?
Well, it starts in everyday life, in everyday settings. And it's a sense of responsibility that's developed through real work. One of my favorite quotes on this is from Pope Francis in his climate encyclical Laudato Si. And Pope Francis uses biblical passage about the connection between caring and cultivating. And he said, we don't cultivate unless we care about something, but we don't care about something unless we're involved in helping to cultivate it or make it or build it. And that's messy and complicated. It's Mari, when she was at Luther Seminary, did a wonderful piece on the wilderness days, the 40 years in the wilderness, as developing a way of life with many dimensions, many setbacks, many moments in which the Hebrews wished they were back in Egypt because it was a lot easier to get food and shelter. Right. Many things they built, like the tabernacle, many different kinds of governance systems, like decentralizing government. At one point, you may remember Moses complains to God. He says, God, you should kill me. This is just too much. I can't do it. I can't handle all these demands from the people. We were better off when we were back in Egypt, and I didn't have to worry about all this. So God says, bring me 70 of the elders before the 10 of the presence, and I'll give them the same spirit I give you. Now that's a shared understanding of power. It's a different model of power, different understanding of governance. So there were many dimensions and many setbacks in the wilderness, but people had to, over time, learn how to build a culture and a society together. So one of the things that's distinctive about America that makes me proud to be an American, and for many progressives, it's not fashionable to say you're a patriot. I wouldn't say I'm a nationalist. I would say I'm a patriot. And I learned this in the civil rights movement and the citizenship schools. Our citizenship handbook that we used all across the South in the 900 citizenship schools. Has a passage on patriotism, which is remarkable, saying, we love this great land, and we're going to, through nonviolence, pour buckets of love like concrete into the raging torrents of hatred until we were able to build a bridge across our divisions. Nonviolence, of course, was a very strong theme in citizenship schools. And one of the reasons that America has been the seedbed for so many democratic movements, from suffrage and moral reform movements in the 19th century among women, and the freedom struggle and unions and the New Deal, and was that people have both drawn upon and expanded the definition of who the people are. So, of course, the original Constitution, which grew from the Declaration of Independence, said, we the people create government as our resource and partner to do our work. It didn't say we're handing it over to government. We create government. It starts with we the people. And the definition of people was pretty narrow in that point. It was European American, British mainly, males with property. But it did have a larger, a kind of open boundary to the we the people. And so every movement has drawn on that, and also the Declaration of Independence, and expanded the definition of we the people. But that, it creates a kind of authorship of the democracy, which is extraordinarily important. Government was not handed down from antiquity. It wasn't bequeathed by a monarchy. It wasn't the nobles in a bliss oblige. It was actually something that people created. And they can recreate, and they can build it, and they can expand it, and they can make it more inclusive and diverse and pluralist. And I think that's a great resource we have. And if you look at any broad democratic movement, including the civil rights movement, the concept of we the people was really central.
You mentioned building bridges, Harry, and you just mentioned some of the groups and some of the some of the organizations and groups and the people that have built those bridges over the decades and over the years. Who are some of the bridge builders today that are helping to build those necessary bridges to keep us moving forward?
Yeah, well, the group I've been most involved with is Braver Angels. Let me just note that there are a number of groups that are bridge builders, where basically the agents of change or citizen workers is how I describe it. They wouldn't necessarily use that, but they do. People in our world use the concept of citizen as co-creator, which is a kindred notion. Not a client, not a consumer, not simply a helper on the side, and not somebody who does charity to other people, but a co-creator with others. So. But in that world, Pratt School across the street from the church has Public Achievement, which is a youth initiative that began in 1990 with Jim Scheibel, the mayor of St. Paul, and a team. Spread to many sites in the US and other countries, but it's basically young people doing what we call the work of democracy or public work. And they choose their projects, and they have to be nonviolent and make a public contribution. But they do all sorts of things, issues about racism or bullying or teen pregnancy or cleaning up the neighborhood, so it's quite inspiring to see sometimes. I mean, sometimes they don't work, but in general, young people really get a great deal out of feeling they are the authors of change. And there's the nursing department at Augsburg has picked up the idea of public work and co-creation and citizen nurses. And they have two health commons that people could become involved with. One, Central Lutheran Church downtown is a homeless health commons, but it's not like a service provision. It's a place where people can come and make friends and choose and decide on projects. And the nursing students don't wear uniforms. They get to know people. It's a much more egalitarian, horizontal relationship. There's also one in the Cedar Riverside area that's with Somali community folks. And then I would say our colleagues at the University of Minnesota in the Citizen Health and Citizen Professional Center do a number of projects in this spirit, including work with the Native community in the Twin Cities around diabetes, in which the diabetes decisions, and they're led by Native people. bringing in their own health practices and traditions, and then also people from the academic health center at the university are involved. So the fact that they lead that project means that the health outcomes, in just traditional medical terms, are phenomenal because people feel that they're doing it. The work I've been doing recently is something called Braver Angels, which I think a number of people have heard about. I've often mentioned it.
Right.
So that began in 2016 in Lebanon, Ohio, rural area, where David Lapp, a guy who works with working class whites, low income and working class whites around family issues and opioid questions. He was working with a group called the Institute for American Values, David Blankenhorn, and David was really concerned about the increasing warfare between blues and reds, or Republicans and Democrats, right, especially after the election. So he asked David if he could get together an equal group of Clinton supporters and Trump supporters. And then he brought in Bill Doherty, who he had worked with. Bill is the founder of the Citizen Professional Center at the U, and the projects he's worked on include all sorts of projects, so some of which I mentioned, including a black men's project in police in North Minneapolis. But Bill, over the years, turning his brilliant family therapy methods, he's one of the great family therapists, into public skills, basically thinking, how do we bring those kind of practices to the nation or to the community? Right. He developed a method for a weekend retreat workshop, and the people went into it, 8 Democrats, 8 Republicans, thinking there is no way I'm going to deal with the other side. There's a wonderful video of that, by the way, on the Braver Angels website that goes through the experience and has all the voices. And they ended writing a declaration saying we were wrong. We didn't change our minds on all these issues, but we still have disagreements, but we understand that the other side is not malevolent, it's not mean-spirited, it's not bigoted in the way we thought. People are intelligent, they're concerned about the community, concerned about the nation. So after that, and after a couple of bus tours and a national public radio show with communities all across the country writing in, this organization was formed. And I think there are really some distinctive things about Braver Angels. So its mission is to depolarize America. I think there are about 1,000 members in Minnesota.
Oh, really?
There are affiliate chapters. There's a very lively program. And now it's not only red and blue, it's also crossing the racial divide, and rural and urban. And the Democratic DFL is using it to depolarize the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and the moderate wing of the Democratic Party. So the method, which I would say is based on, so this is what's really distinctive. Rather than saying, what do I disagree with, or what's wrong with those people's belief, which is the normal way we deal with people who we disagree with, whether it's family members or people out in the world.
Right.
It starts by people claiming their own strengths and with a mission of building relationships, not to paper over disagreements, to recognize there are big disagreements, but what is a person's story? What is their history? What is their interest? What do they see as their own contribution to the community? And I would call it an asset-based approach and a relationship-based approach rather than cognitive, judging people's views. And then a developmental approach. So rather than thinking, we're correct and they're bigoted or idiots or parochial, we're all on a journey and we all have things to learn. So those elements make it very distinctive, really unique in a way. And also I think it creates a culture of abundance, not scarcity. The way we interact with people around conflict these days is scarcity. And, it's also a particular view of power. We've got to hammer those people into thinking the way we do. So it's a very different approach.
One of the questions I had prepped here, Harry, was talking about the role of the faith community and faith communities in the work that you're doing and creating these the citizens working for democracy. And what you just described was with the Braver Angels organization really seems to fit right in line with that in terms of the role of the faith community.
Well, absolutely. In fact, we have an election initiative that Bill pulled me into called With Malice Toward None. And we're signing up faith communities, Christian, including Protestant and Catholic, the Basilical, and also the Unitarians, and also evangelical churches in the Twin Cities are joining. The real differences philosophically, theologically, but recognizing we can't hate each other. We have to learn how to listen to each other.
Mm-hmm.
But also civic groups, like the Boys Clubs and Girls Clubs of America and the Rotary Clubs, the Citizen Climate Lobby, cross-partisan climate group, and then also finally colleges. So we're signing up a number of colleges. It's hard. There are challenges. So the University of Minnesota, there's units in the University of Minnesota that want to be involved, like Ansem House, a Christian center for discussion and reflection and Bible study, wonderful place at the U, but they want to be involved in Braver Angels. But the university as a whole, it's too riven ideologically to actually, the administration won't do it. But some, most all the Lutheran colleges and a lot of the locally rounded schools have. But the faith community is really important. And actually my own work, before I came to the Humphrey Institute, I had been doing a lot of writing about faith-based community organizing. And I was especially impressed with a network called the Industrial Areas Foundation, which had its roots in the 1930s. And the founder of that network was a guy named Saul Alinsky, the famous organizer. But he signed up churches, but he didn't really pay attention to what they believed. But after he died in 72, a group of religious and faith leaders, organizers, Ernesto Cortez, Doug Miles, in Boston, African-American leader, had been involved in civil rights. A number of figures thought, let's take our faith traditions more seriously in terms of empowerment and in terms of creating a plural culture where we don't hide our beliefs, but we don't try to impose them on others either. We listen, we learn to listen and appreciate other beliefs. And the Industrial Areas Foundation was very impressive to me. And it remains to this day the only major community organizing network which is cross-partisan. They don't do issues without having both Republicans and progressives and different points of view. And they have a very broad range of faith institutions from, in a city like Chicago, they have all the Muslim mosques and the synagogues and the different faith traditions. So I was very interested in that and the potential of faith communities to really produce a democratic culture. I've written a lot about that. But I also was frustrated that it was kind of confined, the richness and the depth of that approach was confined to the organizational form of a community organization. So our beginning work actually was finding institutions that were interested in kind of going deep on civic identity. There a number of Catholic schools, the College of St. Catherine, a Lutheran nursing home in the Minneapolis, cooperative extension, all sorts of institutions. So we took and translated those practices into institutional life, and we found that actually the key to making institutional change to deepen the civic culture was for people's work to become more public. That was the language we began to use. By that we mean full of purpose, recognizing what's the larger purpose of our work.
Right.
Also more interactive and more plural and more visible and valued, publicly valued. So, and that proved a key to the work we've done.
So there are lots, it sounds like, there are lots of organizations, initiatives doing this kind of work here in the Twin Cities.
Yeah, there are.
We may not always hear about it, but they are there and working very diligently toward this.
Yeah, one of the best sites is the Citizen Professional Center. If you just people Google that, or we can do a link on our church site. I would think that's good. But the Citizen Professional Center, which uses a public work approach, so it's, citizen workers of democracy approach. I mean, their range of projects is really remarkable. So it's professionals learning to be on tap, not on top, not squeezing out lay leaders or thinking about them as doing for, but actually collaborators. And of course, what that does is it gets beyond the hubris and the sense that we're the experts and we have the answers. So you look at that website, and a really powerful project is the Black Men in Police project, but also suburban families dealing with crazy lifestyles of hyper competition and trying to get their 2-year-old children into Ivy League schools and losing family meals and just being overscheduled all the time and having crazy birthday parties. It's competitive with everybody else. So it's really quite a range. And it does show that the work of democracy or workers of democracy can take place in many settings.
Right. Fascinating. Harry, there's considerable speculation that this fall's election could result in some type of constitutional crisis. For example, if the president refuses to yield the office, if he is not officially reelected, what role would democracy workers need to take if this indeed happened?
Well, the first and most important principle is not to sit back and wait. Not leave it to somebody else. To be actors, not spectators. And before we started, I was mentioning, I have a former student, Jane Ayers, who's a wonderful organizer who was associate director of the Boyte Health Services at the U and then became assistant commissioner. And actually, she led a coalition around the light rail in the Twin Cities that involved that they had to fight for this, but they got stops at the communities of color and the low-income communities along the right. So she's really a good organizer, but she became assistant commissioner of health, at the Minnesota Department of Health. And there she led the whole department in a process which created a different narrative around what a healthy Minnesota did, which involved making racial equity central. The longer paper that this short piece is out of, I tell the story of Jean as well as Bill Doherty and others. But now she's the national director of a coalition of all the public health groups and this department's, the secretaries of state and the state election officers. And it's basically an initiative. I'll send you the 2-page sheet she did to ensure accessible and safe elections in the fall, in November, and all the ways you can get involved in doing that, from being election workers to making plans to have your family safe in voting and poll watching in a variety of ways. It's a nonpartisan coalition. And actually tomorrow, and I'll send this link too. Great. So Braver Angels has a partnership with a group called the Former Members of Congress, which is all the alumni of the Congress. And interestingly enough, they tend to have a civic awakening, a conversion after they get out of Congress. They're very interested in cross-partisan things. So we're doing a project with them every week, a conversation between a Democrat and a Republican former congressperson on issues of the election and race and climate. But this week is on elections and safe and accessible elections. And I'm moderating that. And we tape it tomorrow, and it'll broadcast on Friday. So I'll send you the link for that.
That'll be great. And I would assume that it will be available on the website. And
yeah. It's on the website. The project is called Yays and Nays. Former elected officials hold a civil conversation about the election.
Yeah.
And we have, so it's directly on this point. We'll talk a lot tomorrow about how people can get involved.
Great. Harry, we're coming down to the last few minutes here. Just a quick aside, I had wanted to ask about Alexis de Tocqueville and his work in the 1800s and study of democracy. I would love to do that at a future time if we could. And
Sure,
that also
absolutely.
ties into, I know, your interest of the CCC workers, the 1930s, and of course your
Sure,
work in the civil rights movement. Would love to follow
sure.
up.
No, I'd be glad to continue this.
That
Absolutely.
would be great.
There are a
Before
lot
we,
of there are a lot of other eddies and angles and tributaries to the idea that democracy is the work of the people. It's not the work of politicians.
absolutely.
Politicians play a role, but they're not the heart of it.
So two final questions for you. Are we at a crossroads moment for democracy here in the country,
Yes,
perhaps
yes, yes.
around the world?
Not only in the U.S., but around the world, which is one of the reasons this election is so important. I think if we can turn back the tide of polarization and hatred this election, it will be a significant movement. Not that a new administration would solve our problems for us, but going back to the earlier point, it would create a more hospitable environment for doing the work of democracy.
Absolutely. And if you had one suggestion for our listeners as potential citizen workers of democracy, what would it be?
Join Braver Angels. $12. An amazing series of discussions, podcasts, forums, debates in Minnesota, affiliates in Minnesota, figuring out how to work together across differences. That's what I'd suggest.
Fabulous. Harry, always a pleasure.
Yeah, that's
Really
great.
appreciate
Thank
your
you, Dave.
insight
This was great.
and
This was really
engagement.
interesting, important.
Yep. And we look forward to circling back post-election, perhaps talking about how things went, and also again circling back on the work of past generations in terms of
And the other thing you should look forward to is Mari
absolutely.
doing discussion like this around her democracy work in Africa. So it's full of brilliant lessons, like how the organization she was part of staved off a racial cataclysm in South Africa in the transition from apartheid. Ask her about that.
Really looking forward to that. Harry, thank you again.
Sure.
You can find more information about the Sabo Center for Democracy and Citizenship online at augsburg.edu, and you can also find several of Harry's essays, including Civic Agency and the Cult of the Expert, based on his experiences as co-chair of the Civic Engagement Subcommittee of the Obama campaign back in 2008, and you can find that at kettering.org. And for a recent podcast, speaking of Braver Angels, for a recent podcast on the Braver Angels website on nonviolence, which Harry was a part of that conversation, go to braverangels.org and search Harry Boyte on the homepage. And you'll find all episodes of Tower Talk on our website at prospectparkchurch.org. And if you have comments or questions about the program, please email them to prospectparkumc@gmail.com. My thanks to Tower Talk
Thank you,
producer
Dave.
Angela Hayde-Vincent.
And thanks, Angela, for setting this up.
And Harry, thank you again. Pleasure to have you here.
My pleasure.
I'm
Okay,
Dave Nyberg. Thanks for watching.
bye.